Hey guys, and welcome back to today's video on more on Python functions. Let's get started. So quite a few videos back we covered about writing functions, but in that video we only covered how to structure it and then using with basic Python constructs. In this video, we're going to cover a few more advanced techniques that we can do with Python functions, namely using default parameters, named parameters, and variable numbers of parameters. All right, so we'll get started with default parameters. So default parameters are the ones that where if you do not give it a number as an input parameter, then instead complaining about the value is missing, you can use a predefined value instead. So here's an example of using a default parameter. So here you see find first. Basically, what it does is item is the value that you're trying to find. Data is a sequence of a bunch of different items inside, for example, like a list. And then start index is where you start looking for it. Okay, so let's have a quick look at what it does. So here I implemented find first. Okay, and for the item, I'm trying to look for apple. And in data, I have a bunch of different fruit and vegetables. So run this one. Okay, and call find first. We have item, data, and normally we will have to provide start index. For example, let's find it starting from the very beginning position as 0, right? And it finds that item apple is at index 2, so we can quickly see that 0, 1, 2 apple exists right there. So it's good. It does what it's supposed to do, but what we can do with a default parameter is that if I don't give it a value, so if I didn't pass in anything, normally this will complain that you forgot to provide another variable, but because it has been given a default value, I don't have to. So if it's missing, it will use the value instead. So here I get the same result without getting an error, although I only passed in 2 parameters instead of 3. Okay, so this means if I don't give it a value, I will use the default value of 0. So I wouldn't be calling this function with 0, but only if I have to change my starting index. For example, all right, I found something from index 2, so let's move on to index 3 and find if there are any more items, for instance. And here it found 5, index 5, so here you can see that at index 5, the 6th item in the data, it finds that there's another apple in there. Okay. So this is how you can use default parameters. Basically, you can assign a value to use. If a user that don't define what the value it is, then this default value will be used. Okay, so this reduces the code repetition and helps do one small job really well, right? And there are some rules for using default parameters. For example, it has to be at the very end. Why do you think it's that? Yeah, I'm listening. Yeah, possibly. Well, basically, imagine you put this default parameter in between item and data. So let's give that a go. Actually, I do have that in the next slide. Oh, we'll do it anyway. Okay, and so say I want to use the default value 0. So what I do is I just pass in item and the data. What's going to do is, oh, I need to reload. Sorry, reload. Okay, and when it loads it, it's going to complain straight away. Basically, non-default argument follows default argument. So this is a non-default argument follows a default argument. Basically, if I have a default value in between, as a user, I'm not sure if I pass in a variable, in the second position, whether that should be assigned to this default value or the one that has been assigned. Okay, so that's the some restrictions on using default parameters. Make sure that they are at the end, and all of them can be defined as default parameters as long as all of them are at the very end. Okay, so don't put them in the middle. Okay, and arguments are matched to parameters from left to right. Parameters with our defaults must come first. Okay, so that's the default parameter basics. Okay, so let's have a look what else we can define. For example, can we put in equations in the default parameter? And the short answer is yes, as long as those values have been defined. Okay, so put this back and move on. Okay, so here's an example that we saw on the slide. Okay, first one. So here what we're passing in as a default parameter is that y gets a value 2 times 3. And since both value 2 and 3 are known, we can calculate this and then assign that value to be a default value. So I run this and then call add val or 6. Then I can pass in x. I have to pass in x because it's not defined, but I don't have to pass in y. So in this instance, we'll see that it's going to return 12. So if the values are defined, then it is fine to be used even if it's in an equation form, as you can see here. And of course, I can pass in the parameter value for y, then it will ignore the default value and use the one that I pass in instead. Okay, so that's all good. So let's hide that and then try to use our second one, which is illegal because although we are expecting value x to be passed in as a parameter, so you may think that this value will be known when we use this function. However, the value used in the default parameter has to be known at the time of definition. So definition means when this function gets loaded into our namespace, the value has to be known. Okay, so if I run this, then this is going to give me an error complaining that name x is not defined. Okay, so you do have to be careful with that constraints on using default parameters. All right, so hopefully that's quite straightforward using default parameters. Next, we have variable parameter lists. So sometimes we don't know exactly how many parameters people would like to pass in. For example, if you want to calculate the average value out of all the numbers that the user provides, for instance, that input can be a various size, right? So this will be applicable to functions that receives any number of arguments. So for example, Python has the built-in function max, and basically you can pass in how many different numbers you want to pass in, and it will be able to handle them. And this is achieved with a variable parameter list. Okay, so we use a special character star to highlight that this parameter is going to capture all the other numbers that are coming into this function, and it's going to store it as an iterable item. Okay, so here our max is defined here, and basically what's happening is you have to pass in at least one value, and if you do provide some extra items, then everything's going to be stored inside this rest variable. So let's run this, and it finds 43 as our answer, which is true. So let's have a look a bit more details about what is going on inside this function. So firstly, let's have a look at the type of the rest. Again. Okay, so it prints class tuple. So this means the type of the rest is tuple. Okay, and then let's have a look at print the content of the rest, run it, and inside the rest we have values 432, 43, and 2. So that is these items other than our very first. So even though I didn't create a tuple using these values, automatically it creates a tuple of all the remaining values for us, and I can add some more values after that, and it's going to just increase the number of items that are stored in the tuple for us. Okay, so that is what this star rest do. Okay, so in definition, you use this star sign to say that this is going to be a variable parameter list, but when you use it, you do not put the star in front of the variable. You just use it using its name. Okay? So since it's just a tuple, I can treat it like an iterable, so I can chuck it into the for loop and grab the value associated with each item at every location, and just do the normal computation as we expect. Okay. So that's pretty much all about the variable parameter list. Okay, it just captures multiple items as a tuple. Then you can iterate through the tuple to do what you need to do with the bunch of items. So the last item in this video is the keyword arguments. So it's going to use combinations of default values as well. So the scenarios is like this. Sometimes we have too many input parameters to pass in, and often as a programmer we may not necessarily remember exactly the location of different types of inputs that we need to provide. For example, was it a name, age, height, address, postcode, or name, address, postcode, age, height, etc. Right? So keyword arguments allows us to define exactly the value that we're trying to give to a specific parameter. So let's have a look at this example here. So we have this function called describe creature. Okay, and our first example is our normal usage that we have seen before. So we know that the first item has to be name, species, age, and weight. Okay, so this is what it's doing. We know exactly the order of parameters that we need to provide, and we run this, then it behaves exactly the same. Okay, so that's not a problem. However, if I don't know the order, but I know exactly all the parameters that are required, then I can specify them in any order as long as I cover all of them. So here I'm saying that I know there's an age, so it's going to be 122. I know there's a weight, I know there's a name, I know there's species. So obviously the order we provide here is different to this order that we expect in the function. But what Python allows us to do is, if we specify it, it will automatically map it out to these input parameter variables automatically. Okay? So here again, we don't get an error because it knows that age needs to go to the third variable, weight needs to go to the last, and so forth. Okay? And finally, we have this example where we specify age, weight, species, but name Frodo in between. So as we have seen before with the default parameters, if we assign a default parameter in the middle, it can be confusing for the functions to map it to which variable is supposed to go to, or which parameter is supposed to go to. Same idea here. I can specify the rest. We think that it might know that this is supposed to be a name, but this is not consistent with how we arrange the order of input parameters, and therefore this is going to complain us that in specific it's going to be a syntax error. Basically the position is not where it's supposed to be. All right, we could quickly check by moving this to the back, okay, and run this. We still get the same error because this is not the position of the name that's supposed to be in. Okay, so this is an illegal use if you don't specify the values, if we are doing the keyword argument, we need to specify all of them, or the value of the item, the parameter you're trying to pass in has already been defined with default parameter. So for example, where am I? Instead of Frodo, let's get rid of weights. Here, name equals Frodo, and say that weight equals 100 by default. Then I don't have to provide the weight value, and this time it will not complain about it. Okay. So let me just click. So this, if you combine it with the default value, it's very handy. So for example, we have some function called Honda Civic order, where the default values are color blue, engine size of 1500, and form is hatch, and all the other things, right? Then if we need to make a modification to our order, then we only have to provide the modification, and everything else will stay as a default. For example, I want a toolbar. Okay, then add toolbar equals true. In addition, I want to change the color and I want a bigger engine size. Then I just have to specify these, and everything else will be stayed as a default value. So this is very handy, especially when there are a lot of options, and often it is very difficult to remember exact order of how the input parameters needs to be passed in. Okay, so we don't have to worry about the parameter order. We'll just match the names and give the values that needs to be changed from default. Okay. So here's a couple of quizzes. I will actually leave this for you to try. What you should try to do here is try to guess what the output of each one is, and then see if the expected output is given to you. All right. And of course, we have the second page of quizzes using default parameters. All right. So that's all the contents that are examinable, really. But I do have one more slide that I want to go over, which is KW args. So this is not going to be asked as part of the labs or the questions, but it could be helpful. So before, we have seen a star args, the one that created the tuples of all the inputs into all the items into a tuple, right? So it's a tuple. But there's another option called KW args, which uses 2 stars to capture all remaining keyword arguments, and this is going to create us a dictionary. But we haven't covered dictionary yet, which will be covered in next 2 or 3 videos later. So don't worry too much about this but basically what happens is it's going to capture, if you provide like a parameter name and its value, and you can provide as many as you want, then it's going to create what we call a dictionary, where the key and value pairs are created as a dictionary item. Okay. However, as noted here, this isn't used actually that much because not often that you will have an arbitrary number of inputs matching from variable to value. So you may not find this useful, but it is good to know. Possibly, so if you see a double start KWRs, or this is your variable name, then you understand this is going to generate a dictionary, whereas a single star is going to create you a tuple. Anyway, so that's it for this particular video. I will see you in the next one. Bye.